So good evening and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Philip Young and I am the co-CEO here at Commonwealth Club World Affairs. And I've happened to have the privilege and opportunity to work for the past 30 years on Asia-related issues, including China, Taiwan, and Japan. And so today you're with us to hear someone who has had really a front row seat to the mechanizations and politics in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing for decades, and a person who has the amazing talent and privilege and ability to write about these issues for a living. Okay, David Sanger is the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times, and he joins us for a conversation today about the new world that has emerged. In his new book, Cold Wars, the New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West, David Sanger explores the changing nature of superpowers and global conflict. And he reflects on world politics and its interplay with technology. David, welcome.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your book.
The Commonwealth Club and World Affairs. I think I've been here for just about each one of the books I've written, and it's always one of the great fun conversations.
And we were just talking, I've known David in various iterations as well. We haven't seen each other for quite some time.
That's right.
And we were talking about nuclear weapons issues, I think, back then. And so it's...
We will be again tonight, so
Yes.
don't worry. They haven't gone away, as it turned out.
So the way I usually do this is we are going to touch on what I think are big picture issues that David really alludes to that are really important. We're going to talk about Russia, China, personalities, maybe some specific questions germane to the Bay Area. I mean, David's book covers so much. And so what I'm going to do is just touch on a little different things like a smorgasbord, really, to get you interested. And then hopefully during the period of time that we have set aside for me to get some of your specific questions as we move forward. Okay, so big picture. Let's go to big picture first. The last 10 years, I've really talked about how the world has truly changed. Now, a lot of people didn't believe me, but now post-COVID, the world is never going to be the same. And I know that, David, you've been thinking about this as well. And your book, in essence, looks at this transformation at the international level. So the book covers the last 50 years, maybe a little bit more, but it really focuses more so on the events of the last 15 years and the interplay between Russia, China, and the United States. And what I found really interesting about all this is that you talk about all these specific instances that we all know about. And that David will allude to. I mean, oh yes, I remember that, reading that in the news. But your book is not just about what happened, where, and how, but you connect the dots, which I think is really, and as a reporter, he tells a very compelling story. So with the end of the Cold War in 1989, we have great hopes for the world. We talk about the end of history that folks like Francis Fukuyama, that he famously coined, and we've had here at the club. We talked about the post-Cold War world for the longest time when I was in government. We never knew exactly what that was going to be. That transformed into globalization, and yet it seems that it hasn't quite turned out the way we thought. And so as you said in your preface, you talk about this is a story, your book, about how we misjudged what would happen after the Cold War ended, the last Cold War, because. So tell us what you mean.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me back here, Phil. It's great to be with all of you, and thank you for coming out, because not an easy thing to do these days. So we really appreciate your being here. This is first and foremost, Phil, as you would expect from me, a book of reporting.
Yes.
It is not a pontification on the world. Set out some questions about how it is that we could have so misjudged what the world would look like, that we believed in that end of history theory. And it wasn't just Francis Fukuyama. He takes a lot of heat for that, but
yeah.
He was hardly the only one. I mean, I remember going with Bill Clinton to Beijing toward the end of his time. in office, and he went to Beijing University. Well, first of all, he went to an internet cafe. What a concept, right? As if there was a cafe, there was a cafe set up specifically where you could work from the internet.
Yep.
This was pre-Wi-Fi. And then he went to Beijing University and gave an absolutely brilliant speech on how the internet would not only set the Chinese people free, but how it would undercut the authority of the Communist Party.
You know what was great is that I was there. I was working at the White House, doing for the White House, seconded to put that all together. So I remember that very
very
it was
speech.
an amazing speech.
It was an amazing speech, and when you look back at it now, you're like, oh my God, how could we have been this wrong? Because it turned out in the end that the internet and other digital technologies turned out to be the instrument of exquisite control that has kept the Communist Party in place despite all the forces that should have washed it away.
Yeah.
It enabled them to track down dissidents. It enabled them to put facial recognition to work so that they could make sure they knew where every single human being was, and your chance of escaping the net was pretty low. It became a way to repress the Muslims, the Uyghurs. It became a subject of repression or tool of repression in Tibet. And so it was just a classic example of how our understanding of how we thought things would play out, that everyone would see how everyone else lived, the freedoms they lived in, and soon they would rise up and, it would bring about peaceful political change, was just plain wrong. Now, it turned out that wasn't the only one that was wrong, and this was a pretty bipartisan thing. And the first chapter of the book, and Phil, you've gone through it, and a few other people here, I see with their copies here, when you get to chapter 1, after we've laid out the opening days of the led to the Ukraine war, are to float down the Neva River with George Bush and Laura Bush and Putin and his then wife. And the Neva, of course, is in St. Petersburg, and it's one of those late May nights, and the sun is shining till about 11 o'clock. There's music coming off of the boat. I was in the what's called the pool boat right behind it, the reporters behind it. We boarded briefly, and when we did, I remember seeing this hulking guy who was standing behind Putin and Bush serving dinner. And the image just stuck in my mind. I had no idea who he was.
Right.
And of course, when I went back and found the photos of it, as my wonderful researcher and co-writer Mary Brooks and I were working on the book, I said, Mary, we've got to go find a photo of this thing. We found video in the end. Of course, it's Prigozhin, right? When in the days when he was still Putin's chef, before he got around to trying to fix the 2016 election through the Internet Research Agency, before he started the Wagner Group, and certainly before he did his ill-advised march on Moscow last year. Right?
And then his plane was shut down, right?
Well, it blew up mysteriously. I can't imagine how that happened.
Mysteriously, how did that happen?
That moment sort of sets everybody on the stage. And what was remarkable about the dinner that they had was the conversation. It was Putin talking about whether Russia might join the European Union. And you'll remember this from both Clinton and Bush days, whether Russia would join NATO.
NATO, right.
Right?
Right. That was
the whole idea was, wouldn't it be the culmination of this sort of end of history moment if Russia joined the alliance that was created to contain the Soviet Union and became a full partner? And so what happened over the next 15 years, and this occupies the beginning part of the book, was that in both Russia's case and China's case, Phil, we took every small moment when we were all working together and blew it out of proportion.
So you talk about Russia in terms of sort of the point. There was a very similar thing with respect to China as well, right? Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of how people were looking at China.
So for China, in Russia's case, we had early warning this was going bad, right? I mean, Putin turned against the Chechens, and went on to do things that we'll talk about a little bit later on. With China, you had 2 or 3 leaders in a row who were allowing some fruits of democratization to take flower. You'll remember there were local elections in China. There was discussion of Chinese-style democracy. Nobody thought it was going to look like anything that Thomas Jefferson would recognize, but it had elements to it. The turn for China really came with the installation of Xi Jinping.
Right.
And we got him wrong.
Right.
And you talk about the big intelligence failures. We all think about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, so forth and so on. To my mind, given the import of China as the central adversary to the United States, the competitor to the United States, the country that wants to be the dominant military, political, economic power by 2049, the 100th anniversary of Mao's creation of the People's Republic. Getting this one wrong was really bad. So when Xi Jinping was vice president, they assigned our own vice president, a guy named Joe Biden, to go out, develop a relationship with him. Xi traveled in the United States. Biden traveled around remote parts of China together. And as Biden himself will say, he spent more time with Xi Jinping than any other leader in the world. Unfortunately, he was spending time with a different Xi Jinping than the one who ultimately became president of China. And so what did we miss? We missed Xi's secret speeches to build up their nuclear force to the level of Russia and the US, for which, by the way, I don't blame them. We missed his decision to crack down on Hong Kong and basically throw out the agreements that they had made with the British. We missed his crackdown on free press. We missed his buildup against Taiwan. In fact, the intelligence reports all said that they expected him to focus on the domestic economy and not confront the United States.
So it seems, okay, then one of the things, so your assessment then of Xi as an individual seems like, it seems like what you're saying is that he alone he is the one who has caused this major shift to where we're going. Which
by and large, he's taken a path that none of his predecessors did.
So talk about, you talked about Xi's secret speech in January 2013, which came 2019. Talk about that in terms of the impact of that. And because for so long, people were talking about, China has never really been one to look at the United States as a zero sum. They want to get along into the world. And that was sort of the consensus for a very, very long time. Now it's changed.
So the roots of our misperception in both Russia's case and China's case, so they're obviously wildly different societies and very different economies. But we fundamentally convinced ourselves that at the end of the day, they would consider the expansion of the Chinese economy, the ability to sell into this market and buy from this market, and in Russia's case, the ability to sell oil and gas around the world, would outweigh their territorial ambitions, their ambitions to express their power and in influence in other ways, and that they would essentially sign on to Western institutions, Western values, Western rule of law, because it would be too important to them to keep those markets developing. So really interesting question. How did we come to this conclusion and get it wrong in both places? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we had at least a 50-50 shot at getting it right once. Right. And we failed to.
And why do you think that is?
So a bit of it was bad intelligence gathering, okay? But these are hard to penetrate societies. A good deal of it was wishful thinking.
Okay.
A good deal of it was we are the unipower that emerged from the fall of the Soviet Union, and thus we will remain the unipower. And there were people out at the time saying, look, none of this lasts forever. Go ask the Portuguese how long it was that they were running the world, And they're doing many great things now, and the food and wine is fabulous, but running the world is not like one of their main features these days. And I think the other thing that happened was that we ended up doing the classic projection of what was important to us.
And not them.
To them, right. So, we had a succession of presidents, but I would say Donald Trump was the epitome of this, who basically came to the conclusion that countries at the end of the day would always act in their immediate economic interest, because that's how he thought about the world. We're always going to get the greatest deal. And that's just not the case. It was not in Putin's economic interest to invade Ukraine. It was not necessarily in Xi Jinping's economic interest to crack down on Hong Kong, the one place that had long been the interchange point between the West and yet what we've learned time again and again is their hierarchy of values was different than ours.
So here's what I really liked about this book is that you put a lot of the relationships between the relationship with China and the United States, and the relationship between Soviet Union and then Russia and the United States in larger context. And you go through the first part of the book, kind of giving the history. And in some ways, you're saying, here's where we made some mistakes, right? So with respect to Russia, as we go through this, you kind of alluded to this, but can you give us maybe some specific examples? I mean, some people were talking about when the Cold War ended, we used our unilateral power. We were thinking that NATO expansion was something else. Tell us a little bit about that, because that's not necessarily, it affected Putin, but Putin wasn't in power at that point in time, but it led to a general zeitgeist of of some animosity towards the United States, correct?
There was, and animosity mixed with a sort of self-hatred in Russia of what had gone on. So obviously, as the former Soviet republics break up, several of them, starting with Poland and others, decide they want to sign on to NATO. There were people at the time, including George Kennan, who was still alive, saying this is a really bad idea, that this is going to create the conditions that will force the Russians at some point to lash out. My own view is, having told these countries they were newly freed, it would have been really hard for us to say, if you've met the conditions of joining NATO, you can't do it.
Right.
Essentially what we're saying to Ukraine today, right?
Yeah.
And so I think they sort of had to go do this. What's interesting is you hear many people saying what Putin's trying to do is restore the old Soviet Union. If you read his works and you listen to him, that's not what he has in mind. He thinks the people who ran the Soviet Union were idiots, okay? Who gave too much power and independence to the socialist republics like Ukraine, and they then felt free to break away. When you listen to his own works, he says what he needs to restore is the Russia and Greater Russia of Peter the Great. And you go in his office, I've only been in it once, there are no photos, no paintings of the great communist leaders. There's a bust of Peter the Great. It's not so subtle. Okay. Okay. And so Ukraine was a piece of this. And so we weren't listening carefully to Putin. So in 2007, 5 years after that float down the Neva River, he shows up at the Munich Security Conference, which is, summer camp for you and me, right?
Right.
And others here who do this for a living. And he gives a speech that says there are parts of Peter the Great's old Russia that need to be reunified. Bob Gates, then the defense secretary, stood up and said, I've been through one Cold War. He had been, of course, CIA director during the Cold War. He said, I'm not really in a mood to do a second. It wasn't so much fun the first time. But people moved on. We didn't even put this on the front page. Remember when the New York Times had a big print edition?
yeah,
And we
yeah.
had a front page? Yeah. Anyway, it was barely there.
Right.
Okay.
And this is something we missed that you were saying,
Missed.
right?
Fundamentally missed. So
Yeah.
7 years later, this chapter is called The 7-Year Itch, with apologies to Marilyn Monroe. 7 years later, he takes Crimea, and Obama looks and says, look, I'm not going to war over a Russian-speaking peninsula that Khrushchev gave back to Ukraine in the late 1950s. So the U.S. wasn't going to step in a big way. The sanctions that ultimately were put on Russia for that, it took a year to put them together. And then only when that airplane was shot down by the Russians. Okay. So what is Putin supposed to conclude from this? That the West doesn't really care about Ukraine, that they'll do sanctions that will make them feel good but won't affect his life very much. And we move on, we get to 7 years after that, and he's beginning to move on Ukraine. We can talk about those moments later on. I don't think he came to an unreasonable conclusion.
Okay. So let's think about, so then let's switch over to China then. Is there kind of a, the historical context from your perspective of where we missed, I mean, you allude to a little bit, but where we misjudged what China was feeling and what they were thinking, and how Xi actually seemed to be, using that to his advantage?
Sure. So China was different because it was growing quickly, but it was never considered to be a particular military threat to the United States, even in the 90s. And I tell the story there because I had just gotten back to Washington from years as a foreign correspondent in Japan. I went with Bob Rubin, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary, to China. It was only the second time an American Treasury Secretary had ever been to China, because the economy wasn't that big. And I asked Rubin on the way over, certainly in your 25 years of Goldman Sachs, you must have gone to China. And he looked at me and said, never been there. He said, we never thought it was a big enough market to be worth our time for the trip.
Things have changed.
Life changes. So he goes, and we do the Great Wall, and he meets the Chinese leaders, and he tries to go encourage every moment where he can see a sort of American-style business starting up, and asking them about how they might get listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, or who does their accounting, and they're looking at them like, accounting? Right. But this was all about channeling China into the system. And the hypothesis of this was getting them to join the World Trade Organization. And the theory was that over time, the rules of the World Trade Organization would so move in on the Chinese that they would begin operating the way a European member of the right did. What was not discussed as they pushed this through Congress was the possibility that China was joining these institutions to change the institutions to fit China's rules, which is essentially what has happened over the past 15, 20 years, not just with the WTO, but also with the groups that set rules for governing the internet, groups that set rules for what we consider to be free speech and what we consider to be regulated speech. So that is what really took off in the Xi Jinping era. The other thing was, Glenn, you were working in proliferation issues at the time. We never really thought about China as a significant nuclear threat because they set a minimum deterrent, right? For 200 or 300 nuclear weapons, enough that they could put a nice dent in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Chicago if they ever needed to, but not enough that we really thought about it.
Just as a comparison, I think China, 300-400 nuclear weapons, the United States thousands, and it was just for them to say, if you hit us, we're going to hit you back. So
That's right. They actually had, until a few years ago, just 200.
Yes, 200. Right.
They are now at 500.
Yeah.
And President Trump kept saying, well, I'm not going to re-up our arms control agreements with Russia until China joins in. And the Chinese came back and said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll do this one of two ways. Either we'll build up to your numbers, which Trump administration thought maybe wasn't a great idea. We both have 1,550 deployed, right? Or you guys can cut your arsenals down to our numbers, which it turned out that we weren't willing to go do either.
Right, right.
It was somewhat of a brilliant play.
Right, right.
Think about it.
And then, is there something that we missed? So, do you feel like the Chinese always looked at the United States in retrospect, or is it something that evolved as their relationship with the United States is a zero sum?
It evolved, but I think we kept looking at it wrongly. So first of all, we captivated ourselves in the thought that they were there mostly just to steal our designs and our, and they did steal some. The F-35, the most expensive fighter jet you've ever paid for with your taxes, they managed to hack into the contractors' internal designs, and the Chinese equivalent of it looks very much like our F-35. We've heard a lot of that too, but then we got ourselves stuck in the thought that all the Chinese do is steal and imitate, when in fact they had started up the Made in China 2025 program quite openly to get to be self-sufficient in semiconductors, battery technology, biological products, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all the areas that 2 years ago Congress came around to the thought that maybe we ought to be funding as well.
Right.
So they've had a consistent industrial policy, not always successful, and I tell the semiconductor story at some length later in the book.
Yeah, we'll touch on that a little bit later.
But so they were living off of our old concepts of what they were doing, and at moments they were helpful. In 2015, I covered the Iranian nuclear talks intensively for a year and a half. China and Russia were sitting on our side of the table with the Europeans. If we ever got those talks going again, which I think we have not a chance of doing, but if we did, they would not be sitting there. They would be on the other side.
Yeah, we worked on, we were both covering that in different seats during that period of time. So let me switch gears a little bit and stick actually to the big picture, because it was something that really struck me about, kind of your assessment in terms of American foreign policy in general. And it was sort of our approach, our big picture approach, which I can only think of as a way you describe as mechanistic, input in, and output, right? And what you said is one characteristic of the post-Cold War era, particularly after the United States exhausted itself in Afghanistan and Iraq, was Washington had far less ability to shape other countries' actions than Americans like to believe. Okay, and then you talk about a quote from National Security Advisor under Trump, H.R. McMaster, basically in his previous writings about accusing the United States of strategic narcissism. Okay, so I thought that was quite interesting, and I think it's something for our audience to take away as a way to think about, is this what we're really doing?
Yeah. So McMaster was the most interesting of Trump's 4 national security advisors. That's a lot of national security advisors for a one-term president, right? I mean, the guy only managed to have 3 wives, but he had 4 national security advisors.
Yeah, exactly.
McMaster, of course, was brought in after Michael Flynn, went up in flames about a month into the Trump presidency. And he came in determined to write the national security strategy, which every new president does, and to use it to try to turn the U.S. government away from its focus on the age of terrorism and toward an age of great power competition. And he actually wrote a really interesting, well put together national security strategy that was an effort to try to turn the ship here. I remember we sat down, we went through it, we talked it through. I had been talking to the staff who had been working on it along the way. And it would have been perfect, except that when they sent President Trump out to announce it, it turned out he hadn't read it. And
Yeah.
he gave a really good speech about counterterrorism. But in fact, what that strategy did was begin to get people to recognize that we had put all the incentives in our government toward chasing down al-Qaeda and so forth, and that meanwhile the rest of the adversaries of old superpower conflict had come back. But the strategic narcissism piece of it was the assumption that it's within our power to shape everything that's happening in the world. And when you have the rise of other powers, not just China, but others as well, our relative influence is going to go shrink. And you have to pick your battles carefully. I mean, think of today. You know, Biden had wanted to move the U.S. out of the Middle East so he could do the pivot to Asia that has been talked about but not executed for 10 years. And the Middle East has dragged him back in. He wasn't planning on doing anything with Russia other than managing its disruptions and let it go into sort of soft decline, when suddenly he finds himself having to go fund and fight a war in Ukraine. So we have to make some choices, and it's no surprise that we've seen this movement revive. We've had it many times in our history, to say, oh, the world's too complicated. Let's just all retreat back to the United States, build big walls. Anyone comes for us, we're going to make them pay a price, but let them all fight it out. And, you know, we've tried this at various times in history, and it's always turned out the same way, which is we may not be interested in the rest of the world. They're interested in us, and our interests get sucked in sooner or later.
So let's pull on that just really quickly. So you have, you know, H.R. McMaster, big picture strategic thinker. He sort of moves, you know, U.S. policy towards, you know, big power thing, which was sort of passé at that point. You have another person that you talk about, Matt Pottinger, who was in the National Security Council, who was on China. And
probably the most impressive member of President Trump's national security staff, and stayed on through until he left on January 6th.
Yeah.
Interestingly said,
he was a former reporter too.
Former Wall Street Journal reporter, former Marine, really interesting, and Mandarin speaker.
Right.
And this is what we sort of lost during the Trump administration. There were some highly qualified people who were beginning to do some really good work that just got stepped on by all the chaos.
Right. And so in the same way, so I guess so just to fill in the blanks really quickly, so Pottinger then starts to restructure U.S. policy towards China as more adversarial, more zero-sum. The interesting thing that you talked about is you got these two really impressive people, strategic thinkers, doing one thing, and then Donald Trump seems to be doing something else, right?
He does. He's, I mean, partly because he didn't want to go focus on it, but partly because he was always in pursuit of that one-time deal that he thought would make him look good. So there are phone calls that he has with Xi Jinping where he basically says, I'm not going to give you a hard time about Hong Kong. Go do what you need to do, as long as I can get my trade deal. Okay. You know, he always, if you dangled the trade deal in front, and so there was none of the strategic thinking that would have put together the good work being done underneath. Underneath, they were thinking about how do you make sure that our allies and even countries that are debating between China and the United States don't adopt Huawei and build their 5G systems around Huawei technology, because once they do, they're going to be dependent on Beijing for their telecommunications and thus everything else. How do you begin to lower American dependence on Taiwan and on China for the most advanced semiconductors? How do you build up the industry here? But they could never quite get it executed because the president wouldn't sit still for this.
So we're in election year.
I noticed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and one of the candidates is surely to become is Donald Trump. Can you speculate a little bit what it's going to look like if he is elected, and what kind of foreign policy? Because you have that tension of, it seems like the Biden administration, as you pointed out, followed and built on a lot of the strategic foundations that was put in by some of the staff of Donald Trump.
Right.
Right.
But we don't have much guarantee of what this would look like
Right.
after. First of all, we have no idea who's going to be in these jobs. But in the first term, Trump was determined to get people who he thought looked like they should be in the job. He kept saying, Rex Tillerson looked like what he thought a Secretary of State should look like. And he picked him in part because he was told, well, he'd been very successful running Exxon and, of course, dealt with Putin at that time and so forth. And, I covered Tillerson. It was really interesting. Here's somebody who had never been in government before, and he spent his first couple of months, as he later told me, in the State Department examining its reporting structure and figuring out if you could reduce the staff by 30%, because he had done that at Exxon, and it had brought about significant cost and efficiency savings. And Exxon, it turned out, and the State Department had roughly the same number of employees. So you would have thought he might have wanted to come in and think about maybe the new combinations of power between Russia and China, but he decided to spend his time on the org chart. Ultimately, he said some unpleasant things about President Trump. I think after a meeting in which President Trump said, if we have all these nuclear weapons, why are we so unwilling to use them? And that was the beginning of the end for him. And Trump, who started off by saying that that Tillerson looked just like what a Secretary of State should look like, later publicly said he was, I think the phrase was, dumb as a rock.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So just a reminder, folks, we have cards out there. If you have questions that you want to ask, please give them, and we have some people who will be picking them up, and folks online, please let us know, and we'll present the questions as well.
But just to finish the thought
Yeah.
on that, so in the first term, though, he managed to hire some people who we thought were, serious foreign policy and military policy types. My guess is that a next term is more likely to look like his last year in office, where loyalty, not your foreign policy chops, are going to be the key element.
Okay. Something to think about. Let's talk now a little bit more about Russia. I mean, one of the things that is extraordinary about your book is just the access that you've gotten. And I think people here and those listening would be interested about your kind of quick takes, or they don't have to be necessarily quick, of the personalities. History is personalities, right? As we have seen in the two relationships that we're talking about, Putin as well as Xi, and who they are and what their intent is and what kind of people they are, is absolutely critical to where we are right now and where we're going to go. So can you give us a flavor of anything you want to say? When I say, Vladimir Putin, tell us about him as an individual, and what is it that we should be keep in mind about him, and what surprised you about him?
So I'm a reporter, not a psychologist,
Right.
so I'm probably dangerous doing this. Insecurity strikes me with Putin,
Interesting.
first and foremost. It drove him crazy in 2012 and 2013 when Hillary Clinton publicly suggested that maybe he had fixed the election, wasn't even for president, it was for the Russian parliament. And that led to protests, which he then claimed had been American-inspired. And I'm absolutely convinced that the reason that they went in and did the 2016 election stuff and tried to fix it against Hillary, but for Trump, was in part out of his anger at what she had done in 2012 as Secretary of State. Tells you a little bit something about it.
Wow. Okay.
Xi, on the other hand, highly secretive, never gave any real indication of where he was going, but clearly had a plan in his mind to build up the state and take on the U.S. He came to the Rose Garden in a visit to in a visit to Obama in around 2016 or 2017, right after China had gone into the Office of Personnel Management, the world's most boring bureaucracy, and stolen 22 million security clearance files, including
mine.
yours. Yep.
Yes.
It was really good reading, Phil.
Yeah.
And these are not just, as you remember from filling out the forms, this is not just like your Social Security number.
No, it's not.
This is your entire financial history. It's every relationship you've ever been in, every foreigner you've ever met.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty fulsome stuff. We left them unencrypted and inside the computer systems of the Interior Department, where they got the same protections as, say, bison migration in the West. And they shipped them out for a year before we noticed, okay? And so then Obama has him, and they're supposed to reach some kind of cyber agreement, which lasted about a year. But what was interesting was that she stood in the Rose Garden one day, and he said, "I have no intention of militarizing the South China Sea."
Right.
A year later, we're running satellite photographs of military hangars being built, and then of Chinese fighter jets lined wingtip to wingtip on these islands in the South China Sea. So he has no problem stating outright something that he knew at the time completely contradicted his plans.
So it seems like, I mean, South China Sea, you know, I was heavily involved in sort of the policy making, you know, in the early 90s. And it was sort of sleepy water, and I suspect that's the reason why I got that particular issue at that particular time, because no one else was really interested in it. I learned a lot. And what I noticed over the years, the last 30 years, this is salami slicing tactic, right? Yep. Little bit. Do you see that happening? That's going to continue?
Oh, and you see it around the world. So what's happening now, Phil, is that we are going around the world and basically forcing nations to choose. Mm-hmm. So the other day, there was a little interesting corporate announcement that you wouldn't have noticed unless you're reading the pages of the business section of the Times or of the Wall Street Journal, which was a Microsoft investment of $1.5 billion in a UAE company that does artificial intelligence called G42. This deal was conceived of inside the White House, not inside Microsoft. Okay? It was conceived of there out of the fear that China was gradually getting a foothold in artificial intelligence in the Mideast and spreading on to Africa. And that the only way we were going to bring the UAE together was not just the kind of diplomacy that you were trained in doing at the time, but actually having a trusted American company investing in and sitting on the board of an AI firm in the UAE. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I went to go talk to Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, who's been one of the most fascinating activist members of this, at the core of the strategy for denying semiconductor equipment to the Chinese and for building up the U.S. industry. And the way she phrased it to me was really interesting. She said, when it comes to advanced technology, David, she said, you can't be in China's camp and be in the American camp. You have to choose.
So do you think it's not, so that's really interesting. I also want you to talk about the Solomon Islands thing, because Solomon Islands no one really ever talks about, and yet it's a very interesting and quite illustrative of sort of the tactics. But don't you think China's doing the same thing?
They are. And they're doing it with Belt and Road.
Right.
And they're doing it with Huawei, right? And you don't build two communication systems in your country. It's a little expensive, right? So you're either going to wire it up with a Western system or you're going to wire it up with a Chinese system. And if you wire it up with the Chinese system, guess where the central control comes from? And this is the essential argument over TikTok,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So TikTok's interesting because name for me another piece of Chinese software that is used ubiquitously by American consumers. There is none.
Right.
Right? And we've never really managed it. But why are we worried about TikTok? Are you worried that they're going to collect your personal information? Well, as we learned from the OPM case, they don't need to be in your iPhone in order to be able to take your data. They've got it already, thank you. But people are getting a lot of their news through TikTok. It pains me as a New York Times reporter, but it's true, okay? And so if you don't understand, if we don't understand the algorithm that goes into selecting that news,
Yeah.
then suddenly we're in a world where a foreign nation is selecting how you're getting that information during a presidential election year. Remember, there are old laws in the United States that didn't allow foreign ownership of TV stations, for example, and so forth. And yet TikTok isn't covered because it's not a TV station or a regulated instance. And China, of course, does not allow Facebook, does not allow Google, does not allow Apple networks in China. So what we have created in the information space is essentially a new Iron Curtain. There's a physical one that we were thinking about in the old Cold War. In the new Cold Wars, you have to think about that as an information space.
So looking back, do you think it would have, in hindsight, do you think it would have been possible for us to say, we're not going to allow TikTok in unless you let Facebook and others in? Would that have been a
Could have
possibility?
been, but TikTok crept up on us, right? In 2017,
Yeah. Who knew what that
who
was?
knew
right?
what it was? And then, it came in as dance videos. Like,
Right.
really? This is and I just wrote in the Times last week in a big series of stories we wrote. I came to TikTok thinking it was a parenting problem, not a national security problem.
Right, right.
And I have come around on that view.
I am with you. My son is on that a lot. All his friends are on it a lot. They get their news from it. It is unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. Now imagine for a moment that, let's say you were currently sitting as president of the United States and your approval ratings weren't like super impressive, okay? But you're hoping for the young vote. You're going to turn around and rip TikTok out of their phones between now and the election?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Okay, so I have an outline of how we're going to do this. Our conversation is going in all these different directions. So let's talk. We're talking about technology. Big deal here in where we are here in San Francisco, and it's a big deal all over the country. We're the home. AI is the home of the Bay Area to AI, and you talk about the implication and the impact of AI on espionage, war, international relations. And it's pretty incredible. Can you just sort of
Sure.
outline some of those issues for
Sure,
us? I think people need to hear this.
Sure. So let's just start with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay. In the run-up to the war in Ukraine, the U.S. collected pretty exquisite intelligence to suggest that Russia was getting ready to invade. It made a lot of this public, which was a big deal, and I described that at length in the book. But in the end, some of the final indicators that the Russians were really getting ready to roll didn't come from our spy satellites. Didn't come from some spy sitting, in the Kremlin. It came from some software engineers who were watching the Russians activate malware that they had put in the Ukrainian government systems. That message went up through a corporate ladder over to the White House and fed into, it wasn't the only piece of evidence.
So it's extraordinary. We had corporate America participating in what's going on, right?
Right, and then what did corporate America do? Microsoft and Amazon World Systems, AWS, in 1 week's time, put the entire Ukrainian government into the cloud their pension records, their ability to communicate back and forth between military units, all that. Why? Because at the time, Ukraine was operating out of server farms that were in Ukraine by law. Had to keep all the information about Ukraine in Ukraine. And everybody was pointing out to them, as soon as the Russians put a missile into each one of those server farms, you are out of business as a government. And they put it in the cloud, and sure enough, the Russians did take out the server farms. What had we not thought about when we put Ukraine into the cloud? That if they didn't have a way to communicate up to the cloud, they weren't going to get their own data.
Right.
And it was Elon Musk who came along and sort of saved the day on that. Now, we all have other issues with Elon Musk, okay? And we're only like a few blocks from the Twitter headquarters here, so I'll be careful what I say because I only got my blue check back the other day, mysteriously. Okay.
Okay, we'll be watching for that, okay?
But the fact of the matter is that he put them back into communications. And then one day, as Walter Isaacson wrote about in the Musk biography, and I take up in this book, the Ukrainians call him and ask him to turn on Starlink around Crimea so that they can target some Russian ships that are around there with their own missiles. And Musk refuses to do it because somebody had told him if they take out those ships, it's going to start a nuclear war. It's going to start Russia using nuclear weapons. So think about this for a minute. Suddenly, an entrepreneur is making a decision that you would normally expect maybe the Secretary of Defense or the National Security Advisor to make.
Right.
That's a pretty empowered private sector.
So do you think that, well, the implication then you're saying is given the ubiquity of technology, the ubiquity of AI, which I believe is going to become sort of what we call a fundamental technology for us as we move forward, it seems that individuals and corporations are going to have a lot more power than they had before.
They already do.
They already do, but they're going to also be required to make choices in a way that traditionally they've tried to avoid,
And
right?
they already did.
Okay.
So they signed on, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, with Ukraine. They took sides right away. Yes, the companies can no longer afford to say, I'm going to stay above international politics.
So here's a question. So thank you for your questions. I'm going to start going those and combining them individually. And I apologize if I'm not, don't have a good chance to get to it. So here's something that you and I, when I last saw you, we talked about extensively in non-proliferation issues. So what is the state of the U.S. weapons stockpile? We briefly alluded to that. Are we replacing weapons that we are going to give to Ukraine? So I think what we're talking about here is talking about, let's talk about the nuclear impact, the threat that Putin used for tactical nuclear weapons. Now, let's define tactical nuclear weapons and tell us why that was so extraordinary.
So first, I think the question that you just read sounds to me like they were asking about non-nuclear weapons.
Non-nuclear weapons.
Okay, let me just touch on that briefly. We've learned a lot of things from Ukraine, and that one of the ending chapters about this is how Ukraine has been a laboratory for what works and what didn't.
Yeah.
But the biggest shock we've had is that the great arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt, revved up, we couldn't turn back on because we had put so much of this out of business. We have one factory in the United States at the beginning of the Ukraine war that turned out 155 millimeter artillery shells, because who was going to go fight an artillery war in Europe again? Right. It's about 2 miles from the house where Joe Biden grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
That's the only one.
That was it. There are now others getting going. They had to go find these old retired guys and bring them back in to show some younger workers how to actually use this machinery to make the artillery. Okay, we were in that bad shape, and we were in good shape compared to the Germans and others. Now, on to your nuclear question.
Yes.
There was a remarkable moment and a remarkable month in October of 2022. It happened, Phil, to be the 60th anniversary that week of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And the U.S. picked up, through intelligence you'll read about in the book, intercepts of Russian generals who were discussing for the first time moving tactical nuclear weapons. These are small battlefield nuclear weapons that you could sort of shoot out of an artillery cannon, essentially, and using them against Ukraine. So think about this, a nuclear-armed state preparing to use nuclear weapons in a battlefield context against a non-nuclear state. And there was a pretty big panic in the White House.
Okay.
They sent Bill Burns out to go talk to his counterpart. There was one weekend when Secretary Austin talked to his counterpart twice, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs talked to his. We wouldn't have known this had happened had it not been for the fact that that same week, President Biden went to a fundraiser in, of all places, James Murdoch's townhouse in New York.
Right.
James Murdoch being the sort of black sheep of the family. He's a Democratic fundraiser. And so there are all these nice New Yorkers standing around with their glasses of wine looking at Murdoch's art collection. And Biden comes in and says, we are facing right now the first possibility of the use of a nuclear weapon since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he didn't mean like at some point in the distant future. He meant like in the next 2 weeks.
Right.
Okay? And we're facing a situation we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because I'm convinced if there is the beginning of the use of battlefield nuclear weapons, you don't stop the pathway to getting to Armageddon. His staff came to call this Biden's Armageddon speech. Okay? There were no cameras. There were press there. We reported on it at the time. Every alarm bell in my head went off,
Right.
And I called one of his aides and I said, where did this come from? He said, well, it's exactly what he said to us in the Oval this morning. I said, okay. And, that began to unravel the question of where they were getting these warnings. Interestingly, they were successful in getting Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi in India to go make public statements saying there is no excuse for the use of nuclear weapons in this conflict. But I don't think this is over.
So so in your opinion, again, given what you know, do you think that there is a very, very real possibility that tactical nukes, that they are willing to use them?
Yes.
Okay, no question.
No question in my mind.
Okay, interesting.
If they feel that they are losing.
Losing.
And it's in a chapter that
Nuclear
I call
paradox.
in there called the nuclear paradox, which is a phrase from Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who said to me over lunch one day, David, the nuclear paradox at work here is the better job we do at defeating the Russians' ambitions in Ukraine, the higher the likelihood they use nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's frightening. And just to be clear, what you said was that nuclear weapons and the use of tactical weapons weren't at any point like beyond 50, like going to happen or real. But what was basically maybe just to pull out a number, a 5.5% chance suddenly expanded to something a little bit bigger.
Like 50%.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And everybody from the Secretary of State to the Secretary of Defense to others said to me at that moment, they thought, if the Russians felt they were losing and they were about to be pushed out of Ukraine, which in October of 2022 was not a wild thought. People were talking about a significant victory on the part of the Ukrainians. It's hard to imagine in today's battlefield situation. That's the situation in which they thought it was 50-50.
Okay, so the next question that should be asked then is, given all this, I mean, there's a fascinating, you have to read the book because of the description. I didn't even have a chance to ask you what you thought of Zelensky, and if you want to add a little bit as we answer this question. What's the end game now for Ukraine right now? What do you think? That's a question that a few people have asked, and that was something that I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
Given the nuclear paradox that you just talked about, we don't want to back Russia into a corner. What's the solution?
So, first, had Congress not done what they did on Saturday, That would be an easy question to
So
answer.
the passage of,
The passage of the additional $60 billion in aid will give a shot in the arm
Yes.
to the Ukrainians. I don't think it is sufficient for them to win, but it is necessary for them to stay in the game. And had they not gotten it, Bill Burns said outright last week at a talk he was giving in Connecticut, high chance they would plain old lose the war by the end of the year. Okay.
okay. So big
now-
deal that this was passed.
Big
and-
deal it was passed.
Okay.
A good chunk of that money just goes toward replenishing our own stocks, back to the earlier question you got. So not all of this is flowing through to the Ukrainians. But it also sends a signal that we're sticking with it. The delay, the debate, the fracturing inside the Republican Party, and frankly, some fracturing inside the Democratic Party from the progressives who were hesitant on this as well, does send a message to the Europeans that even with a committed old Cold Warrior like Joe Biden, or somebody who grew up in the Cold War time, like Joe Biden in office, it was not a sure thing that we were going to go stick with Ukraine. And so if you're the Ukrainians, you're beginning to think, how do I fight this war on a budget, and how do I make it sustainable? My own view is, at some point, they're probably going to have to negotiate with the Russians, but it's got to come from them.
Right.
When President Trump says, I will solve this problem in 24 hours, I don't know exactly what he has in mind, but I can't think of a way to do it other than go in and carve up parts of Ukraine and say this belongs to Russia and this belongs to Ukraine. Biden has said nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It's really hard to imagine Zelensky surviving a situation in which he voluntarily goes into a negotiation to give up territory. What I argue at the end of the book is we have to think about Ukraine not by its current borders, which have changed over the years, to think about what does Ukraine need. And I see three things. They need to be able to protect Kyiv. They need to be able to protect industrial cities that are the core of the economy. And they need a pathway to the sea to export their wheat.
Right. Right.
But that's got to come from the Ukrainians.
Right.
You know, it can't come from us.
Or anyone else.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have only a couple more minutes. I have one quick question. I have a question. It's a long question. It's a question. I don't know if you can answer it in 2 minutes, but please try. And it really, let's talk about the conclusion and kind of where we are and what comes next. You close the book with an interesting observation. You say that we're in an era that echoes of the early days of the Cold War, Russia, USSR and the United States, and of the period of open great power competition that preceded the First World War. Okay, both of those times, the 1950s, 60s, and the 1890s, to pre
1914.
14, right? Both big power competitions, but one escalated to direct conflict that reshaped the entire European landscape, and the other was a high-tension arms race with proxies, which was largely a stalemate with distinct spheres of influence for each power. So, how do you think this is all going to end?
Sure. If I could do that, I certainly could make more money than what I'm doing as a reporter here.
Yeah.
However, I think there are lessons to be learned from this history. But the book is called New Cold Wars with an S for a reason.
Okay.
The old Cold War had a certain predictability to it. We knew how many weapons they had. They knew how many weapons we had. We knew who had launch authority and so forth. In this new era, we are seeing now a recombination of Russia and China in an uneasy partnership, not an alliance. There was a lot of division even in the Biden administration about whether that was for real. I had the number 3 in the Pentagon tell me one day he thought it was actually real, and he was on the record about it. Mm-hmm. The next day I asked Biden at a press conference, and he said, I don't think these guys can ever get along.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
My guess is he's revised his view. That combination, how Russia and China come together, may be the question, may answer the question of what this era is more like. Okay? Second, we need a strategy in which we're thinking about how we're going to get in the way of that. The reason that Nixon and Kissinger did the opening to China was to prevent Russia and China from coming together. And Kissinger talked about this a little bit at the end of his life, that this was coming to pass. To have that strategy, we need a consistent approach in the United States, not something we're super well known for. And
It doesn't change every 4 years, or for that matter, every 2 years.
that's right. And we have lost the ability, Phil, and this really bothers me the most, to debate these strategies as part of a presidential campaign. If you go back to the Nixon-Kennedy debates and you turn off the video, so you're not looking at like who looks young and who looks sweaty and all that kind of stuff, and you just listen to the content, it was a deep, interesting argument about how you contain the Soviet Union. And ask yourself the question, could you imagine Americans sitting still for that same argument today?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Right.
And that is because the 30-year holiday we had from thinking about superpower conflict, we somehow lost our ability to think strategically about what we want the United States to be. And you're seeing that in the divisions in the Republican Party right now between, traditional Republicans and a group that says this is not our problem. And we need to be able to debate out internally to the parties, but also among the candidates, that issue. Now, I'm not sure we're even going to have a candidates debate in this election. And let's set aside for the fact that this election we will look back at as particularly unusual, I hope, in the United States, in the nature of these candidates. But part of why I wrote this book was to try in my own small way to spur that debate.
Right. So we've run out of time, and I had so many more questions to ask you. Please come and ask those questions.
I'll come back. We'll do a
You'll
second
come back
session.
again. This is great.
Right.
I always have fun talking with you. And I think we end on the perfect note, because that's why we here at Commonwealth Club World Affairs exists. And so to have that kind of open debate, please come back again. Everyone, please give a hand to David Sanger.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. You can get your hands on a copy of David's book right here. New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. And right now outside, Dave will be signing books. And if you would like to engage in future programs, for those of you who haven't joined, you should join Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Please visit our website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.